Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down big topics by going straight to the source. So, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you're constantly falling behind, even when you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing? Yeah, it's a feeling a lot of us know way too well. Today, we're going to try and deconstruct that feeling, that intense pressure to succeed. We'll look at what it feels like, the psychology that drives it, how it all kicks off in school, and then how it gets cranked up to 11 in our 20s. We'll also tackle social media's role in all of this, and then, most importantly, talk about how we can start to redefine the finish line for ourselves. All right, let's kick things off with that feeling. You know the one. It's this weird paradox where, on paper, you've got all the markers of success, but you still feel like you're failing. This quote from the online magazine Lazy Women just hits so hard, doesn't it? It perfectly captures this anxiety that so many people are feeling. You check all the boxes, good grades, a job, but that feeling of inadequacy just doesn't go away. It's incredibly common. So, what's going on here? Why do we feel this way? Well, it seems to be a mashup of a couple of powerful forces. On one hand, a lot of us grew up being told we could be anything, which is great, but it also sets an impossibly high bar. And on the other hand, we live in this culture of instant gratification. We see these overnight success stories all over the place and start thinking, hey, why isn't that happening for me? To really get to the bottom of why we constantly feel like we need to measure up, we have to rewind the clock a bit, all the way back to a core psychological theory from the 1950s. It's a fancy term for something we all do, all the time. We figure out who we are and how we're doing by looking at everybody else. It's just baked into our DNA. We don't exist in a bubble, right? We need these reference points to understand ourselves. And this comparison thing basically works in two ways. First, there's upward comparison. That's when we look at people who seem to be crushing it, who have it all figured out. Sometimes that can light a fire under us, but a lot of the time, it just makes us feel lousy. The flip side is downward comparison, where we look at people who seem to be struggling more than us. It might give us a little temporary ego boost, but it's not exactly a recipe for real, lasting happiness. Now, this pressure cooker environment doesn't just magically appear when we get our first job. For so many of us, it starts way, way earlier. We're talking about the classroom. In the world of academics, this drive is called achievement motivation. One study actually calls the modern school system an achievement race, where that desire to do better than the next person is this huge driver of how well you perform. And research shows a super direct link between this motivation and your grades. A study of 120 high school students found these really clear differences in scores. And what's interesting here is that in this particular study, girls in both private and public schools actually scored higher on average than boys. Now, we can't generalize from just one study, but it's a fascinating look at how this achievement race can play out differently. And here's the real kicker. The same study found a very, very strong positive correlation. That's the 0.826 you see here, between a student's achievement motivation and how well they did academically. Put simply, the more you felt that need to achieve, the better your grades were. So the race seems to work. But you gotta wonder, what's the hidden cost? Well, a big part of that pressure often comes from home. Research on exam stress has found that high parental expectations are a total double-edged sword. Sure, they can be a huge motivator, but they can also create this intense anxiety and lead to complete and total burnout before you even get your diploma. And that race definitely doesn't stop after graduation. Nope. For a lot of people, the pressure just gets turned up to a whole new level as they enter what's often called the defining decade. Our 20s are often framed as this make or break, all or nothing period for our careers. Like this summary of psychologist Meg Jay's work points out, the financial stakes feel enormous. It feels like the choices you make right now are going to ripple out for the rest of your life. So the advice you hear from experts like Jay is that you've got to use this time to build up what she calls identity capital. You know, your collection of skills, experiences, and connections, which only adds to the pressure to be constantly productive, to always be grinding, always leveling up. And what happens when this relentless pressure from school and your early career slams into the messy, complicated reality of adult life? Well, you get something a lot of people are calling gifted kid burnout. It often happens to folks who have a fixed mindset, the belief that their talent is just something they were born with. So when they finally hit a wall and have to struggle, it feels like a personal failing. It's that jarring moment when the person who always got straight A's suddenly feels like they can't keep up, and it can lead to total exhaustion and a real identity crisis. Okay, now we have to talk about the biggest, most powerful comparison engine ever invented: Social media. Technology has basically taken this pressure cooker we've been talking about and supercharged it, putting our natural human tendency to compare ourselves on steroids. Our social media feeds have become the main stage for that social comparison theory we talked about. We are just constantly scrolling through the highlight reels of everyone else's lives. We're always looking at someone else's curated, perfect peak while we're sitting in our own messy, unfiltered reality. To try and fight this, some design researchers are playing with new ideas. This prototype, for example, suggests having two separate feeds, an inspiration mode for all the polished, perfect, aspirational stuff, and a reality mode for the unfiltered, genuine, and, let's be honest, often messy side of life. And this idea gets right to the heart of the problem. Research is pretty clear on this, that constant, unchecked, upward comparison against these perfect, idealized posts is what can really damage our mental well-being. It leads to lower self-esteem and just a general feeling of being unhappy with our own lives. Okay, so if we understand the problem, we know where it comes from, what do we do about it? How do we start to change our perspective and maybe, just maybe, step out of this crazy race altogether? I think the first step is unlearning this idea that's been drilled into us, that our lives have to follow this perfect, straight line. This quote, which was highlighted in an article about burnout, is basically giving us permission to change, permission to take a detour, and to understand that a misstep isn't a failure. It's just part of the journey. It's really all about actively shifting how we think. So, for example, instead of seeing social media as a window into reality, we can start seeing it for what it is, a performance. And maybe the most powerful shift of all is to stop looking left and right at what everyone else is doing and instead focus on a different benchmark. Are you a little better or a little wiser than the person you were yesterday? Now that is a race worth running. Look, reframing this stuff doesn't give us any easy answers, but it does leave us with a final and I think really powerful question to ask ourselves. When you stop looking over your shoulder at everyone else, what does your own finish line actually look like?